Welcome everyone to the learningtobirth.com webinar series, where we interview some of the world's most interesting thought leaders on natural birth and pregnancy. And today with us, we have a man who almost needs no introduction, although he will get one from me, and that is Dr. Michael Klein. He has been contributing to evidence-based care for women, birthing women, for the last 5 decades at least, around the world, and particularly Canada's. And we're very, very, very grateful for him to join us here today. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks very much for arranging this.
This is fantastic. Look, if you are joining us today and you're pregnant or you're a new mom, Michael's got so much wisdom that he's brought to maternity care from so many decades and such a journey that it's going to be really, really exciting to listen to all the wisdom that you have to share, Michael. I'm going to just read a little bit of an introduction about you, because I went to your website and I saw your awards page and I was quite blown away, the deep level of detail of kind of people and how they regard you. So I'll just say that Michael Klein is a family doctor, pediatrician, neonatologist, maternity care researcher and educator. He is the author of Dissident Doctor, Catching Babies and Challenging the Medical Status Quo. He is a member of the Order of Canada, recipient of the Erwin Chabon Award 2007 from LeMays. And they said, in appreciation for his research and support and the strong voice that he brings to normal birth, he is considered a top 20 pioneer of family medicine research in Canada by the College of Family Physicians of Canada. And I hope that didn't embarrass you, Michael, me reading that, but I just really want people to really understand like how you're regarded, and just really be grateful for you being here. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Do you want to tell us how you became interested and involved in maternity care?
Well, you know, I went to Stanford Medical School, and I had no particular interest in maternity care at the time. I got an international child health fellowship between my 3rd and 4th year at medical school. And I went to Ethiopia, where I worked for a year and a half at a children's hospital. Actually, I was the only medical student in the hospital, so they were determined to make sure I had a good time. And after 6 months, which was my actual fellowship, I didn't want to leave, so I asked the dean if I could stay another year. So I wound up spending a year and a half in Ethiopia, and then had to return to Stanford to finish up. So interestingly enough, when I figuratively, perhaps literally, helped to put the babies to bed and things got quiet in the hospital, I would get a little bored and I would walk through a short tunnel to a general hospital, which had a maternity. And in that place, midwives were catching babies. And so being a keen medical student, I asked if I could watch some. And so I watched some, and they helped me assist in others. And by the time it was time for me to go back to Stanford to finish up, I had already attended about 200 births with midwives. And that created a huge problem for me, because one of the things I hadn't yet done was obstetrics and gynecology. Wow. So I reported for duty, and on the first day I was doing some births, couple actually, and I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder, and it was the professor and chair of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Stanford University. And he said, "Mr. Klein, come into my office." And so I followed him dutifully into his office, not knowing what was up. And he said to me, and you're going to find this hard to believe, he said to me, "On my service, every woman will have an episiotomy. And if she doesn't get one before the birth, she'll get one after."
Wow.
What? I wasn't that sophisticated at the time, and I thought it was a joke. Maybe a bad joke, maybe he was serious, I wasn't sure. Then the next thing he said to me was, "If you want to practice primitive medicine, you'll have to go to the county hospital." So he exiled me to the county hospital, where I reported to the chief resident. And to make a long story short, you could do anything in the county hospital. It was poor person's medicine before our national Medicare system. And so I attended a lot of births and had a wonderful time. And I asked the head of pediatrics, because everything was siloed there,
Yeah.
if I could look after the babies after I delivered them. And he said, fine, why not? And that's a good idea. Why don't you do that? So I actually did that. And in retrospect, this was in the 60s, that was family medicine. Only I had no name for it, because going to Stanford Medical School, which is a very, very science-based medical school, rivaling Harvard, that, you know, in that setting, I never saw a family doctor. So if I could never seen one, I couldn't become one. So I initially became a pediatrician. Of course, I saw a lot of maternity in that respect, because I also ran newborn intensive care units for 5 years. And so I got to meet lots of mothers, and lots of mothers who were in difficulty, because I was caring for their sick preemies and small babies, very small babies. And I never thought I would be attending births in any other capacity. But when I was recruited to come back to McGill University to run a family medicine training program, it was clear to me that we had to practice full service medicine, which meant that we would, to do it properly, that we would care for the entire family, literally from cradle to grave, and that we had to incorporate maternity into it. And so I began to attend births once again, and you could say the rest is history.
I have a great deal of respect and appreciation for the medical profession, because actually my father is a GP of many decades now, and my mother's a nurse. In fact, that's how they met. My mum was probably caring for little children in the infectious ward, and my dad was a young doctor, and they got together that way. So I grew up literally grew up in a medical surgery, doing the work there from the time I was little, helping mum. So I have a great deal of respect, and I understand as well, you know, the pressures that doctors can be under from a lot of different directions to kind of you know, do what's considered evidence-based at the time. Now, there might be some women joining us today, or some families joining us, who are kind of, they're just new to birth, new to the whole idea of pregnancy, and even, you know, procedures. They might not know what episiotomy even is. Is there like a little matter of fact way that you can just explain it for them, so that we can really talk about the impact that your work has actually had on the world?
Sure, and I actually should go back just a moment, because of course, coming back to that initial story that I told you, my crime was not attending those births with an episiotomy. So, of course, I never did experience episiotomy use when I was tutored by the Ethiopian midwives. Episiotomy is a deliberate surgical cut, generally with the scissors, between the base of the vagina and the rectum. I could draw you a picture of it if you want, but
I think we can all imagine it. It's quite confronting when you first learn about the procedure as a pregnant mom.
So it's the perineum that's being cut. And if you use another type of episiotomy, which is often used, which is called a mediolateral episiotomy, instead of one in the midline, you cut muscle as well. And so, you know, I learned how to attend birth without an episiotomy. And so I also could see that where I saw it used inappropriately, it could lead to many problems. And well, we can talk about the research and how that came about.
Well, let's do that. Look, you are so well regarded because one of the main things that you contributed very early on in the space in your career moving forward was one of the first, if not the only, randomized control trial of episiotomy and its effects in North America. So do you want to tell us, you know, that was a very brave thing to do, and amazing that you conducted that. Do you want to tell us what you found and what inspired that?
Well, you can see the inspiration must have come from my early experiences.
Yeah.
And you know, it appeared to me very clearly that if you make a deliberate cut in tender tissue like that, and as the baby's head crowns, that the cut might extend toward the rectum, sometimes into the rectum. And
think of like
so
one of those little packets of food that you give your children with a little cut in the side. You can't tear it on the part where there's no little cut, and you have to tear it where there is a cut. It's already there. I mean, that tells me that where there's a little cut, it can go further, and where there is no cut, it might not go further.
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So I decided that there were actually other randomized controlled trials, several of them, that had taken place in England and in other countries, and they were all midwifery trials.
Yes.
In other words, they were midwives studying themselves, and with different approaches here. But they were proper randomized controlled trials, and they showed that episiotomy done routinely caused many problems compared with attempts to deliver the baby without episiotomy.
Yes.
But I knew that this data would be rejected in North America because they weren't doctor trials, and they didn't take place in North America. So I decided that we really needed to do a proper randomized controlled trial. And we did that of more than 1,000 women who were randomly assigned to either try to avoid an episiotomy or to try to avoid a tear, which in medical talk means do an episiotomy.
Yeah.
And so that study showed clearly that, first of all, that episiotomy itself is more painful than spontaneous tears.
Yeah.
Moreover, that the severe kind of tear that affects the rectum occurred in 53 women out of 1,000 in the study. And 52 out of 53 women who had such a severe tear had it in the presence of episiotomy. That's as close to causality as you'll ever get. One woman in the entire trial of more than 1,000 women had a rectal tear without an episiotomy. The other thing I did, which was quite unique, is that I decided that I would measure pelvic floor functioning, which had never been done within the context of of a trial. And so we developed an instrument it has a fancy long name that's called, it's called perineometry.
Okay.
It's actually Kegelometry.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Okay. And it's a very simple device. It just looks like a tampon, and the study nurse would ask the women to squeeze down on that, and we would get a record that showed how strong her pelvic floor was. And so we studied the women's pelvic floor before the birth and after the birth, and we separated them according to what actually happened to them. So the women who had the strongest pelvic floors were those who were intact, who had no tearing. The next strongest were women who had some spontaneous small tears. And the least strong pelvic floors were women who had episiotomy, and especially so if they had one of those tears. The next thing that we studied was pain.
Yeah.
And to make a long story short, the least painful, and we measured this with standardized tools. The least painful is to be intact, obviously.
Yeah. Yeah.
But spontaneous tears are less painful than episiotomy.
Yeah.
That effect lasted throughout the first 10 days in hospital, and it lasted all the way out to 3 months postpartum. In other words, the people who were still having most of the pain were people who'd had an episiotomy. We also measured sexual functioning. And again, sexual functioning, time to resumption of sexual intercourse, all favored not having an episiotomy. I could go on.
It's massive, Michael. What year did you do that study now?
It was done about just before 1990. it had a very interesting effect. You know, I did a content analysis of the most commonly used obstetrical textbook in the world, Williams Textbook of Obstetrics.
Yes.
And from 1921 till 1988, the paragraph was identical word for word. In 1988, it says, some people are questioning this, and everything else is the same. And then after our study, it's rewritten entirely, and it says very clearly that episiotomy should only be used when absolutely necessary, and that you should attempt to avoid it. And we know that you can even have a birth with vacuum extraction and forceps without episiotomy, with great benefits for the mother. And this has been carefully studied as well.
That's really important to know, because that is...
Oh, I also should say that as the result of this study, the episiotomy rate has dropped in Canada and the US from about 70% to about 12%. And the severe tear rate has gone from 4.5% to 1%.
That's incredible. That's, to think that, you know, one man and your team, of course, and the women involved in the study. So we're looking at quite a larger number here, but really, like, you as a group, you've changed the course of birthing history for women, you know, in those countries and potentially around the world. And the impact that you've had, you know, obviously on the basic functioning of their lives going forward, I think is something to have, you know, that everyone can be grateful for. And yeah, we can talk a little bit, of course, how a mother might, you know, go forward in different circumstances. But I have to express my extreme gratitude to you that you've even done this work, because my background before birth, I was in human rights law, and I'd been studying obviously things that are done to women that are wrong around the world, and being active in that space. And then I became pregnant and learned about episiotomy, and suddenly I think I was floored for days. I think I was just like sick for days, because here I'd been advocating for women's rights around the world, only to find that 30, 40, 50, as you said, 70% of women were being treated in this way right in the culture under my nose. And when I would try and talk about, you know, I found out it was done to my mom. And then when I would talk to my friends going into birth, I'd say this thing, you know, I've read about like people like Anna May Gaskin, who in her own, you know, in her own data, you know, very few women would tear. Obviously very few episiotomies, of course. And I was just like, this isn't necessary. This is something we need to question and probably rise up against. And they were like, oh, don't talk to me about that. That's just too horrible. I can't think about that. And, you know, they're all kind of like lambs going to the slaughter almost. So to think that you stood up against the medical profession and did that scientific analysis, you know, it's really amazing that you've done that, and thank you. I don't think the world can thank you enough.
You know, the challenge of getting funded for the study and then getting it published was incredible.
Yeah.
I wrote a paper once using the words of the reviewers, which were frankly misogynistic and off the wall.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it was a hard job getting it published.
Yeah.
And it finally got published because I was so fed up. I called the editor of the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I got him on the phone and I read him back the words of the reviewers. And he was so embarrassed that he sent it out for re-review to a hand-picked panel. And they went on and published 3 articles on the subject. So, you know, he really wanted a proper journal. He wanted a journal that talked the truth. Yeah. And his constituency at the time clearly didn't want to see change. But it's terribly important, yeah. And I won't go on about this. If you're contesting conventional wisdom, don't be surprised if you get pushback, and never take it personally. It's inevitable, and you have to accept it, or you shouldn't be in this business.
That's actually the theme of your book, The Dissident Doctor. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your book, or what inspired you to write that?
You want to see a picture?
I would.
Can you see it all right?
It's fantastic. Is that like a little baby's fist?
That's a baby's fist. It actually is. It's the fist of the newborn baby of one of the researchers at the publishing house.
Wow. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
Hand model from 2 weeks old.
that's right. Yeah, yeah. I had other pictures, but she came up with that one, for which I'm very grateful.
That's really good.
So your question again was, oh,
Oh,
the book.
your book.
Why did
Your
I
book
write
is
the book,
about
and what's it about?
your book. Yeah, your book. Yeah, what was the story behind that, and what is it in a nutshell?
Well, first of all, it's not a book. It's not a birth book,
Yeah.
but it's got a huge amount about birth.
Mm,
In many respects, birth is a metaphor
yeah.
for how we treat people in society.
Mm-hmm.
And if we treat women as they ought to be treated,
Oh,
we
yeah.
likely treat everybody as they ought to be treated.
Mm-hmm.
So birth is a metaphor. Birth clearly affects me very deeply, and the original stimulus for the birth for the book was simply to have a record for my children and grandchildren. I did not set out to write a book. Uh, I chatted about it with somebody in the publishing industry, and they felt I should make it into a book. And they helped me get an editor. The editor was very helpful. She would say things like, this section needs expansion, this section needs to go, and so on. She had very good instincts. I've written almost 200 scientific papers, so I know how to write, but
Wow.
I'd never written a book before.
Yeah.
I've written some things for the public in women's magazines, which of course is different exercise. But I was determined in this book that it would be equally accessible by pregnant women having their first babies and the professions. And I studiously avoid jargon, and where there is jargon, I explain it. And the professionals don't seem to be bothered by that, and the whole birth community seems to be okay with that, as likewise people who are pregnant for the first time. So that's what I hope to achieve. It has a lot about family practice as well. There's stories. There's stories about people who were not supposed to get better and do, and others who should have and don't. Very important to inject some modesty into practice here. And family practice is a soap opera.
Yeah.
And if you don't like the stories, you shouldn't be in family practice. And I love the stories, and I remember the stories. So I never kept a diary, but I have a book full of stories that are told in excruciating detail. I hope they're messages, and they're amusing at times.
I'm going to have to get this book for my mum and dad. It sounds exactly the sort of book that my mum would adore. She loves like people's autobiographies and their stories. And it, because it's on family practice as well, she'd really kind of connect with it. So I'm going to have to get it for her. Fantastic.
It's very holistic in many respects. It includes a lot of contributions from non-medical practitioners. There's a huge amount about midwives. I'm one of the authors of a 5-year study of home births in British Columbia, for example.
Right.
That we didn't study a sample of home births. We studied every single home birth for 5 years, and every single midwife birth, the same midwives in hospital, with a matched sample of physician births in hospital. And we were able to show that home birth in British Columbia, in a regulated, well-functioning system, is as safe or safer than hospital birth for comparable patients. But that's the kind of study, that I do. And there's studies that contest conventional wisdom, but they're scientific, so they're hard to argue with. For example, before this study was published, the College of Physicians and Surgeons would sanction any doctor who had anything to do with home birth. And after our study, they eliminated that sanction. They said, fine, you can work with midwives around home birth. That's fine with us. And that's the state of things right now. And a lot of other pieces of research are about preserving family practice. And again, they're scientific studies. Yes, go ahead.
That research that you've mentioned on the home births, that's incredibly powerful, because you know, different areas around the world, midwives operate under different conditions. I'm really only familiar with Australia, and only a few years ago, I think midwives, you know, come into a lot of pressure for doing any form of home birth. So it became a little bit outlawed even. You had to get a doula or something in Australia. I'm not sure of this situation now. We'll have other people on the webinar perhaps introducing the exact conditions in Australia. But the fact that you were able to do that and prove that, and also to provide the framework of what is necessary for that kind of those kind of good results to come around, like, you know, you're able to show that, you know, what led up to those good results. That's really very powerful knowledge for midwives as a whole around the world.
You know, I think I cut you off when you were about to ask me about what women could do to avoid an episiotomy.
Oh yes, we will ask. We'll
I think you
definitely
were
ask that.
asking it,
So I was fortunate in my circumstances to never have an episiotomy, but I think unfortunately I got a doctor who must have been educated prior to the changes in the books, and he kind of punished me after I didn't want an episiotomy, and it was a very difficult situation after that. And looking back as a mature woman, I think I would have made a good choice to pick a different doctor. So what are some things when a woman finds out she's pregnant, is looking for the right sort of healthcare for her? What approach should she take?
Well, I think you just outlined something very important. If you're attending an old school doctor, and there's still some of them around, much less so among newly trained doctors. And I've studied that, by the way, in a national study of 75% of all the obstetricians in Canada. And they are not doing routine episiotomies. So if you're attending a doctor, I would ask the question quite directly, do you use episiotomy in childbirth? And if the doctor says, don't worry your pretty little head about that, dear, I'll take care of this for you.
Yeah.
Get to the door as quickly as you can and get another doctor.
It's real, ladies, it happens.
Even if the doctor says, oh, I only use episiotomy when I have to, the appropriate question would be, well, what's your episiotomy rate? And if he's put off by that, or she's put off by that, or says that that's my job, again, I would leave. Or I would have her say something like this. If the doctor is reluctant, I would like to know whether the doctor has experience in attending birth without episiotomy. And if the doctor doesn't, you know, you're going to the wrong person. If the doctor is equivocal about it, or, you know, talks about how I'll only use it if I need to, here's the appropriate response from the woman. Doctor, I know that if you try to attend births without episiotomy, there will be some tearing about half the time. And I accept that. And I will not hold you responsible if that happens, because I also know from the research that episiotomy is less painful and has is more painful, and it has more complications than attempting to deliver babies without episiotomy. That discussion is really the beginning, it might not have happened at the beginning, but it could be the beginning of what I like to call contracting for trust.
That's important, isn't it? Yes.
Where you have a conversation about fears, you have a conversation about control, you have a conversation about what your ideal birth would look like. Now, when I wrote that article called Contracting for Trust in the early 90s, believe it or not, the birth plan hadn't even yet been invented yet. And it is a kind of a birth plan, because what happens if you have that conversation around episiotomy or related issues in birth? Women often don't even want a birth plan, because what you've done is established a relationship. And if the relationship is there, the fine details don't matter. If the relationship is not there, the list of do's and don'ts gets longer and longer and longer, and that's a problem.
And it kind
So
of comes down to not being afraid to almost shop around for the right doctor for you. I mean, we don't go to a shoe store and get upset with them if they don't give us, you know, bathers, or we don't go to a car tire store and get upset if they don't sell us a scooter. You know, you have to kind of to go to the right kind of person who matches what you're wanting, because trust is so important. If you don't trust during birth, how can you relax? If you don't relax, how can you have a safe and easy and joyous and, you know, rewarding birth experience? Because the muscles just have to let go, and they can't if you're not feeling safe. So I think that was the big difference between my second and first births. My first birth was where I handed over responsibility. I had someone who wasn't on the same level with me, and then I was having to fight him the whole way, and it was really awful. Whereas, and of course, you know, then of course you mention a birth plan and they think you're even a bigger idiot. And in my second birth, I had no birth plan. I found a team and the sort of hospital that I wanted to birth in. And I went in there and I said, this is what we're doing. This is what's happening. And I got exactly what I wanted. Everybody was on board with me, because they, like, if they hadn't have been, I would have got a different team. I had that level in change and confidence. So it's so important, that trust in yourself. Mostly you got to trust yourself before you can ever trust another team to help.
I don't want to be argumentative, but first and second births are always so different anyhow. But in any case, I think the point that you make is critically important, that you have to find the right person. But we also have to acknowledge that there are a number of women, and I'm sure they exist in Australia, who don't have much choice.
That's right.
They get who they get, which is why opening this discussion, even with people who you might feel uncomfortable with, is important anyhow.
Yeah.
If you're stuck with somebody who doesn't respect your wishes, you're going to have to try to move that person over to your side.
Yes. That's
and of course, advocate for future pregnancies and other women so that they don't have to face that kind of thing.
Well, what we'll definitely do is we'll hopefully provide links down in the content below to the studies you've done, and maybe your article about trust, and definitely like your book that you have, so that women who are approaching you know, their third trimester can read some of the studies that you've produced and have that kind of evidence behind them if they need it. If a woman does, you know, unfortunately tear or have to have an episiotomy in the circumstances where it's indicated, have you seen anything over the course of your life's career where you've things that they can do to help them recover faster?
Well, I mean, first of all, the correct episiotomy rate is not 0.
Yeah.
In women having subsequent births, in my practice, it is very close to 0. But for first births, it's, you know, probably going to be around, even among the best intended people, is probably going to be around 3% or something like that.
Yeah.
And so you know, it is sometimes necessary. One of the really important things is once again to try to avoid it as a critical thing. So for example, if a woman needs to have, back to this conversation, if a woman needs to have a birth assisted by either a vacuum or forceps, studies show very clearly that you know, you can do a vacuum without an episiotomy, you can do forceps without an episiotomy. You just need to know how. Now, if you have an episiotomy, it obviously has to be sutured properly.
Yes.
And it ideally is sutured with suture material that is not going to cause a reaction, ideally.
I had a reaction. It was awful. So that's really good advice. Yeah.
And, believe it or not, if a woman has tears, they heal much better than a straight cut. Like everybody who's had a paper cut knows what I'm talking about. They're really painful. And so one of the things that's important with those tears is not to suture them if they don't need to be sutured. Because, you know, for minor tears, you put your legs together and the edges of the tear come together. Then there are the usual things of sitz baths and heat lamps and that sort of thing.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's interesting. I wonder.
I don't think putting anything on it is particularly helpful. Most things that you want choose to put on it are probably not harmful. Some people believe that vitamin E oil is helpful. I
Yeah.
don't know whether it is or not. It's certainly not harmful.
Mm,
And I think episiotomies will heal,
yeah.
and episiotomies that are tears will heal. And the thing that is critically important is that if the episiotomy extends, that it be discovered, because it can go, if they do an extension of the episiotomy, it can go to the muscle
Mm,
surrounding the anus, and in the worst case, it can go through into the actual opening.
yeah.
And uh, sewing those properly
Mm,
is not a job for an amateur,
mm,
because we're talking about the prevention of pelvic floor dysfunction, urinary incontinence, sexual dysfunction,
yeah.
all of that.
Yeah.
And if those things are properly sutured, even if you're one of the 52 out of 53 in my study who had such a, with an episiotomy,
Mm,
you're going to be okay, but it has to be taken very seriously. And if the person who delivered you
yeah.
doesn't have the surgical skills, hopefully they'll find it, recognize it, that's not an ordinary tear, and get the extra help that they need, even if it takes a little while to bring in extra help. So those tears are really put together, for the long haul.
Is there anything that you would suggest to a first-time mum going into this? Obviously, probably a little bit overwhelmed maybe by the whole subject. Is there anything that you would suggest that she can do to sort of prepare herself mentally and physically, like for the, what can happen?
Don't read the book, What to Expect When You're Expecting.
That's awesome.
You will scare the hell out of yourself and not get much useful information.
Yeah, that's true.
The next thing you should not do is use the internet as your source of information. You need to get good books. And I would suggest the authors that I would recommend, and this is unfair because I could recommend many other authors as well.
Yeah.
I would recommend the late Sheila Kitzinger, who wrote a book every year for about 10 years, and all of her birth books are marvelous. And Penny Simkin, who is a doula trainer, one of the founders of the doula movement, and her books are really balanced and extremely well done. And then I would take childbirth education classes. However, the right kind of childbirth education classes are critical. There are certain, I can't talk about Australia, and I don't intend to, but I can tell you that there are childbirth education classes that are teaching compliance, not education. They're teaching you how to be a good girl and don't make trouble.
Yeah.
And you don't want to be in one of those classes. I would suggest classes that are run by doulas, if you possibly can attend such classes, would be a good idea.
Yeah.
If you're attending a midwife, the midwife will help with this and either do the education herself or get you to a good class. Hospital-based classes are a crapshoot. Some of them are good, some of them are teaching compliance.
Yeah.
But the most important thing, and I can say this directly from our research. So we studied, we did an attitudinal survey of all the childbirth people in Canada, obstetricians, family doctors, midwives, obstetrical nurses, doulas. But we also studied 3,000 women attending their first births.
Wow.
And we studied them throughout their birth, their pregnancy.
Yeah.
And most importantly, in the third trimester, as they were approaching the end of their pregnancy, when they were going to know as much as they would need to know in order to have an intelligent conversation with whoever was looking after them, depending on the issue, between a third and half of the women had absolutely no idea. And they got most of their information from relatives, the internet. People have stopped attending childbirth education classes, even if it's a weekend class, with good people, it's essential, because I mean, in that study, women approaching their first births late in pregnancy, a third of them had no idea what an episiotomy was. A third of them didn't know what the indications for cesarean section were.
Yeah.
Most of the women didn't understand the role of epidural anesthesia or induction. And I mean, we're talking about major issues. And if the women didn't have that information, they are not prepared for
They're not
their...
informed. It's not informed consent, really, is it? So it's a big deal. And it's our responsibility as the people going into the medical system to create that being informed in ourselves and get the information where we need to. And it might be a bit daunting at first and a bit scary at first, but you know, like nurses and doctors, they do it as their life, and we can build up that resilience over time, and you know, that courage and compassion for ourselves, and it is possible to educate ourselves before birth and not get too scared, and actually it's a lot more helps us relax a lot more, I think, during birth, to know what's really happening, and not get too scared, and it's really good to learn. So thank you for those resources there. That's a really important thing to know. Thank you for the recommendations. You have mentioned online in a public forum, like kind of the history of episiotomy and how it was brought into hospitals as a way potentially of moving the care of the pregnant mothers from GPs and midwives to a hospital-based system. I found that really, really intriguing. Do you think what's your perspective on that? Do you think the reverse is going to happen? You know, as time ticks on and the trickle-down effect of new doctors coming through, aware of your research, do you think that the idea that episiotomy isn't essential will then maybe lead to childbirth being handed back to midwives and doctors a little, or what's your projection of the future there?
Well, I can only speak about Canada.
Yeah.
Okay. So the average age of an obstetrician in Canada is 58.
Yeah.
And they're mostly male.
Wow.
New obstetricians are female more than 80% of the time.
Yeah.
They are working less hours, so we need more of them.
Yeah.
In every province, the balance between the type of caregiver varies. British Columbia is the place where there are many more births by family doctors and midwives than by obstetricians. Obstetricians tend to work in major centers for only complex cases. They do consultation. In British Columbia, 20% of the births are by regulated midwives who've had a 4-year education at the university and are fully trained.
Yeah.
And that's why when we have the kind of home birth results that we have here, that we can say it's because people are properly trained.
Yeah.
So the demographics are shifting. So what's going to happen in the relatively near future is that fewer and fewer births will be attended by obstetricians who will reserve their skills for the more complex cases.
Yeah. Yeah.
And midwives and family doctors will do normal birth care. And that's the state in British Columbia, but it's going to spread across the country because there's really no choice to do that. The other thing that's happening also, and I think it's happening and probably happening in Australia too and other places, is that there are small places that are giving up obstetrics so that people are much more likely to be delivered in a central location, which is not good news, because again, our research shows that if you're attended in a distant location by well-meaning strangers, you don't have results that are as good as they would have been if you'd stayed home.
Yeah.
And so, being surrounded by your family and friends and with the right kind of supports is what leads to a good outcome. That's not to minimize the skills when they're necessary, but to go back to your original question.
Yeah.
The discipline called obstetrics and gynecology did not exist in 1920.
Wow.
The discipline was called gynecology.
Yeah.
And after episiotomy was introduced,
Yeah.
and as you say, it was introduced as a tool
Mm.
that could not be used
Mm.
by midwives and
No.
GPs.
No.
And what was promoted at the time was the combined use of both episiotomy and outlet forceps. And that would guarantee that you'd have to be somebody like an obstetrician to do that. And so this all began actually in the slums of Chicago. And the Chicago Lying-in Hospital was formed. Home births disappeared at the same time. And the discipline of gynecology became the discipline of obstetrics and gynecology. The person who was responsible for all this, Joseph DeLee, took over from Williams, who died, and all issues of Williams' textbook of obstetrics were now edited by DeLee, basically portrayed childbirth as nothing more than an accident waiting to happen, and as opposed to the way that most of us view birth as a transformative activity.
It is.
That is maturational, and yes, it's tough going, but you come out the other end a powerful person.
You do. I tell everyone, when people go, how can you do that? I go, I gave birth. I can do anything.
Well, you know, when I don't attend births anymore. I'm 81. I'm not in practice anymore. I'm teaching and doing research. But I kind of lived vicariously with all those births. When my wife is asked, how come he kept doing it, you know, almost a couple of thousand births all those years, and it was so fatiguing. And her answer was, every time he came home in the middle of the night, exhausted from one of those births, he was transformed. He was glowing. And so that's why you do it, because on the other hand, as a general practitioner, as a family doctor, I have death, of course. And this is not only life, but it's the beginning of a family. And seeing husband or partners working together to have their best birth is an amazing experience.
Wow. You know, that's triggered one more question for me, and that is, you know, a lot of us do have partners involved that we invite to the birth, and is there anything a partner can do to support a woman as she's birthing to help her, or, you know, if he needs her to have better care, that he's, you know, whatever your thoughts, like, what would you say to partners out there who are attending a birth?
Go to childbirth educations with your partner, so that you know, so you learn what it is that you have to do.
And they're not scared then, are they?
There are basically two roles for you. One is advocacy when necessary, and you have to be not shy about that, because you know your wife better than anybody else. You know your partner better than anybody else, and you will see things that the professionals don't see, and you have to be comfortable and share it when necessary. You also need to know what it is that she wants from her birth. And when it seems clear that it's not going the way it should be going, you have to speak up.
Yeah.
There are other manual skills that you'll learn in the classes. You'll learn massage, you'll learn some positional stuff. And I won't go through the details there, because that's what you're supposed to learn in the class. But and don't, there are a bunch of wonderfully funny and not so funny movies that are probably giving people the wrong idea.
Don't watch them. Yeah. Watch maybe the water birth movies. They're amazing. Like
those movies that with Robin Williams and other people that with him playing the obstetrician are guaranteed to make you absolutely terrified of childbirth, because it looks like nothing but pure chaos, and it's not pure chaos.
Now, look, we've got so many awesome takeaways from today. I think we can basically know, like, if you're getting your caregiver, make sure you ask important questions to you. Make sure that they're, you know, from the background that you want them to be from, and that you can trust them, because that's going to make a big difference. And just, you know, it's been fantastic talking with you, Michael. I can't thank you enough for your dedication, you know, 2,000 births, all your articles and research, and the way that you've changed the world. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, as you said, down from 70% in those countries, I think down to 12% episiotomy. And I know that there's probably more work to be done still in the space, but you've definitely done a phenomenal effort, and very grateful for you joining us here today.
Thanks very much. It's been a nice, very nice conversation.
Yeah,
And
thank you, Michael.
hope some women having their first births learn something.
And
Okay.
we'll put all the links to Michael's materials and books down in the content below. And stay tuned for the next Learning to Birth webinar.
Okay, bye-bye.